Episode 321, The Future of the Family. The few guards that had been pressuring Joshua and Michael just now exchanged glances, and the dark-skinned man walked up to Aaron.
"Aaron, you said that Michael didn't even clear the checkpoints. You told me to persuade Mr. Clark to demote him. I will remember your kindness,"
he said sarcastically. Aaron was speechless. How could he have foreseen that the usually straightforward Michael would play such a scheme? Although the other guards remained silent, they were all criticizing Aaron internally for this incident. If the news provided by him had indeed been true, it would have been very important to the guards. But his information was false, which made the guards deem him as petty. Behind them, the security guard was asking Simons and Marvin.
"Marvin?"
Simons hadn't expected the security guard to ask about him.
"He came from a special training camp with his brother." "Special training camp?"
The security guard was in awe.
"I didn't expect the special training camps in Evanston to be so powerful. Marvin only followed Michael."
Simons slowly explained to the security guard.
"It seems like he and his brothers were picked up by Michael from outside when he was a child, and their origin isn't clear. Generally, they don't stick their noses into the Clark family's business. We only see Marvin a little more often."
The security guard nodded. He had always known that the Clark family was very powerful, but he didn't expect it to be to such an extent. Anyone from such a special training camp was so powerful. He instantly respected Simons from the bottom of his heart. After sending him away, Simons paused in confusion. This security guard was really strange. On the other side of town, Bessy and Michael were on their way to the Park Place apartments. During their days in Hawaii, Tucker had given them some stuff to bring back to James, and Bessy also had to report to him that Tucker's injury wasn't too serious. Keith wasn't around when they arrived, and James was still sitting at the desk, flipping through a file.
"Will you eat here tonight? I happened to buy vegetables in the morning."
Jack usually didn't allow James to buy vegetables or go shopping, so James always went out whenever he had a chance. Bessy looked around to survey the furnishings in the house and casually nodded. Seeing that she had agreed, James's face lit up joyfully, and he went to Michael with the document. Michael carefully dissected the various economic cases and explained them to him. These economic cases were cumbersome on paper, but when Michael discussed them, James instantly understood them. And Michael was especially. James stared after Michael's back as he went to the kitchen to pour water, wondering if it was an illusion. But Michael seemed more polite to him this time. After eating with James, Bessy and Michael returned to the Highline apartments. Not long after they had left, Jack and Keith came to train James.
"Sorry, James."
Jack lowered his head.
"We've been busy developing software projects for the last 2 days. So we had to push your training to the evening." "It's okay. Michael just swung by and helped me."
James pushed the documents in front of him. Staring at the detailed remarks and clearly organized suggestions left by James on the document, Jack was stunned. Michael again? Bessy's boyfriend, according to James? Jack thought about this in surprise. It made sense, since she was a student of Northwestern University's Science and Technology department. Her boyfriend must be something extraordinary as well. He left with the documents James had annotated and returned to the car. He couldn't help but call Zeke. Zeke was still at the hotel in Hawaii. When the phone rang, he was just coming out of the bathroom, wearing a bathrobe with his fingertips close to his collar. Tucker had just finished writing a paper and was playing a game on the computer. In the past few days, he had been playing the game console that Zeke had given him. This was the first time he played the game that Bessy had downloaded for him in front of Zeke. He didn't avoid Zeke or try to cover the screen. Picking up the phone, Zeke casually glanced over at Tucker. He had just pressed the button to answer the call when his eye caught a movement Tucker made. His hand suddenly paused, and a look of shock appeared in his beautiful black eyes. Zeke clearly saw Tucker open a game icon and then enter a bunch of codes in a familiar, quick way. The call he had answered was already connected, but Zeke stayed silent for a long time. Jack's voice sounded on the other end.
"Mr. Miller, are you there?"
"Yeah."
Zeke slowly opened his mouth.
"Jack, I have some matters to attend to. I'll call you later."
He hung up the phone and walked over behind Tucker, his long eyelashes hanging down.
Tucker, what are you playing?
It's a little programming game. Tucker glanced at him without hiding anything. Uncle, do you want to play? A little game? For programming. Zeke squeezed his phone with his fingers, trying his best to restrain his emotions. He always thought that Tucker just liked to play games, especially more difficult games. So he had asked the people in the studio to collect all kinds of games for him. There were game consoles and smartphone game apps, but he never thought Tucker would play games like this.
Continue playing. Let me watch.
Zeke barely managed to suppress his shock. Tucker glanced hesitantly at him, then sat up straight and continued tapping on the keyboard. Typing in line after line of code, he was so absorbed that he forgot he was being watched. At one point, he even took out a thick book called Introduction to Hacking from his school bag. Bessy had given him this book. He had searched for it on the internet but hadn't managed to buy it, so Bessy had given it to him. Out of all the books she gave him, this was his favorite. He sat in his seat, and because of his good memory, he could flip directly to the page he needed. Then, he compared the program intrusion codes and typed a line of code on the keyboard. He was completely unaware that behind him, Zeke took a long time to return to his senses. Instead of disturbing Tucker, Zeke put on a coat, walked outside with his phone, and returned the call to Jack.
Jack.
He walked to the empty corridor and stared at the lights outside the window. His dark eyes were bright with desire, and he was smiling.
Our family has a future.
In Evanston, Jack suddenly sat upright in the car. He rarely heard Zeke speak like this. Other than the time the family's patriarch died, and once when he had hit a wall in the entertainment industry, Zeke had never shown such a loss of composure.
Future?
Jack's heart skipped a beat. Covering his eyes with his hand, Zeke looked out the window and slowly said,
Tucker.
He talked about how Tucker knew how to program. The two of them were silent for a long time before Zeke cautiously said,
You must conceal this matter. Before you train Tucker, you can't utter a single word or he might be put in danger.
James's existence had long been found out by the fourth son. But because James didn't pose a threat, the fourth son couldn't convince their enemies to worry about him, even if he was brought back to the Miller family. But Tucker was different. At the age of 9, he already had such a high comprehension of computers. He was a direct bloodline descendant of the Miller family, and directly threatened the fourth son's status, and the fourth son was sinister and cruel. Zeke tightened his grip on his phone, and his eyes narrowed piercingly. He didn't want a repeat of the scene from years ago, when the entire lineage was annihilated. The only thing he was afraid of now was that he couldn't protect Tucker or Bessy. On the other end of the phone, Jack was shocked to hear about Tucker's talent. Initially, his sources had reported that Tucker didn't study hard, that he liked to skip classes and play games, and he didn't like interacting with his peers. He was very antisocial, so Jack had paid more attention to James after picking up the two of them, despite James being very difficult to teach. Upon hearing Zeke's words, his fingers shook involuntarily. Could the Miller family possibly be restored to the prosperous age enjoyed by the family 20 years ago? He couldn't help but look out the window.
Why did you call me just now?
Zeke asked, temporarily calming the surge of emotions in his heart.
I just wanted to tell you about Bessy.
Jack pursed his lips.
I wonder if she'll be willing to return.
Don't even think about it.
Realizing what he was about to say, Zeke directly interrupted him and vetoed it.
Bessy is in a very good situation now and doesn't need to go back to the Miller family.
The Miller family was in shambles. He didn't want to draw Bessy into their mess, and he knew very well that the struggling Miller family would only drag her down. Even if the Miller family wanted to rise, it must rise in an upright and justified manner. It shouldn't make use of Bessy's connections, as it would bring a burden to her and her friends as well. Before hearing about Tucker, Jack had thought that the only person who could take over the Miller family was Bessy. At this time, after hearing about Tucker, he wasn't so persistent towards Bessy anymore. Since Zeke opposed it, he wouldn't think about it for now. The most important thing at hand was to protect Tucker. He couldn't be discovered by the fourth son before he could spread his wings. However, Jack was a little hesitant at the thought of Michael, given everything James had said about him. Looking at James's notes, he realized that Michael wasn't simple. Zeke hung up the phone. The manager happened to come upstairs with a bowl of seasonal fruit for Tucker.
"Why are you outside?"
He opened the door directly.
"I was on the phone with Jack."
Zeke put away his phone, his handsome face radiating light. He smiled and then walked into the room with a cheerful attitude. The manager handed the fruit to Tucker, who was surprised to see Zeke's expression.
"Why are you so happy?"
Episode 322. Bessy's Horrifying Connections.
Something good happened.
Zeke closed the door and took out his cell phone again, thinking of how to train Tucker. As soon as the manager came in, Tucker had changed to an easy game that the manager still couldn't understand.
"Noah just left the production crew today."
The manager stared at Tucker as he finished fruits and then sat down opposite Zeke.
"Speaking of Noah and President Soup, don't you think your niece is a little unusual?"
Zeke glanced at him, poured himself a glass of water unhurriedly, and remained silent.
"I originally thought that you couldn't find her address because her location was blocked."
The manager lowered his voice.
"If that's the case, then it's very likely that 129 doesn't have records. But given the current situation, do you think that is the reason?"
No matter what, they couldn't possibly have missed Bessy's name. Zeke's hand paused. He turned to silently look at the manager, then at Tucker. The manager looked at him and uttered 3 words calmly. "Out of fear." Combined with her performance in the production group over the past 2 days, he couldn't think of a better reason.
"Your niece is very familiar with Noah."
He leaned back in his chair and looked in Zeke's direction.
"I also learned from Simon that Noah has the World Poker Tour's backing." "The World Poker Tour?"
Zeke's eyes widened a little when he heard this.
"The god-level arranger Nico is a member of the World Poker Tour. I know the Miller family legacy is a sore point to you, but your niece is now the Miller family's key person."
Bessy's connections were a little frightening. Looking out the window, Zeke pursed his lips upon hearing this.
"She has already come to where she is today. Everywhere else will be easy for her."
It was a Tuesday. It was almost mid-November. After finishing her midterm exams and taking a few days off, Bessy finally returned to Northwestern University and entered a new round of studying. On the second floor of the laboratory, the person in charge was checking the application list.
"The application is due today. Has the last non-disclosure agreement and application from President Flores arrived yet?"
he asked. Applicants for the laboratory assessment of the 4 major departments from both Northwestern University and the University of Chicago had to sign confidentiality agreements with their applications. He pushed up his glasses and looked through the applications. Only one last application had not yet arrived.
"This is for the one they're calling the Queen this year, right?"
The assistant had already called to check on this application and hesitantly glanced at the person in charge.
"I heard that she seems to have taken 2 days off to visit Hawaii. She went to Hawaii at this important time?"
Surprised, the person in charge laughed.
"Why does this student sound even more arrogant than Luke?"
The assistant shook his head.
"Did she not sign it because she's not planning on participating in the December assessment? The confidentiality agreement will be closed today."
"Maybe.
After all, Luke only participated in the assessment during the second year."
The person in charge locked all the confidentiality agreements in a safe. Less than a month was left until the December assessment. Most of the people who participated in the assessment did various experiments and researched complex questions. The laboratory assessment was extremely difficult. Otherwise, more people would be selected every year. To take time off and go traveling at this time wasn't common for applicants. Northwestern University must have been duped into thinking that their queen would participate in the December assessment. As the two of them were talking, a person wearing a lab coat came in and handed them a letter as well as an envelope.
"President Flores sent someone over with this just now."
The person in charge took it and opened it. It was a confidentiality agreement and an application form, with a name signed arrogantly at the top. Bessy Miller. Rosemary had just arrived at the Highline Apartments. She had come early before settling her company affairs. Michael was sitting on the sofa downstairs with his legs on the coffee table and his computer on his knees. Marvin was squatting in a small corner, very seriously holding a small shovel and a series of tools. He was muttering to himself, complaining about how his brother hadn't taken good care of the flowers. Rosemary looked around upstairs but couldn't find Bessy, so she came down and sat across from Michael.
Is Bessy still in school? Wait a little longer.
Michael typed on the computer casually without even looking up.
Okay, I'll wait.
Sighing regretfully, she sat upright, tapped her fingers on her knees, and slightly squinted.
Have you heard that the Institute is going to accept a new member from the outside of the 4 major families?
The Institute specialized in engineering research on weapons and automated machinery. Michael was never concerned about these things and merely replied,
Really?
Why don't you have any feelings about these things? Rosemary crossed her arms and lifted her chin towards him. Don't tell me that you're already fighting with Aaron.
Why would I want to fight with him?
Michael smirked and faintly glanced at her, his fingers pausing for a moment.
The chatter about it has spread all over the house.
Rosemary leaned forward.
The incident with the security guard shook Aaron's position in our family.
I'm so impressed by you. You made such a big move without a single sound.
It was an accident.
Michael couldn't help but grin when he heard this. His face was full of elegant charm, and he simply said,
I won't fight him.
Leaning back, Rosemary frowned.
Why not? You have to know that Aaron won't give you a way out in the end.
The Clark family was considered good under Joshua's management. The Miller family was killing one another and couldn't even squeeze into the 4 major families now. The most important thing in a family was the leader. He must be meritocratic, broad-minded, and elegant. Otherwise, it would be too hard to become generous and compassionate. When Joshua had given his first son the name Aaron, he had hoped he would have a broad mind and a generous heart. Who knew that he would take after his mother in the end? Over the years, Joshua had become more and more disappointed with Aaron. But Michael was still indifferent about the family, and Rosemary was focused on her company. Thus, Aaron had dominated the Clark family affairs.
A fight will ensue.
Michael's calm voice was a little more casual.
But I won't be the one fighting.
He put the computer on the table and turned to look at Rosemary.
It will be you,
he said without any haste.
Me?
Rosemary pushed and then shook her head. How could it be me? She laughed.
It can only be you.
Michael stood up and hooked the car keys on the table with his fingertips. He walked to the door and paused before slowly saying,
The Clark family still needs to be inherited by a member of the Clark family.
He left, gently closing the door behind him. Sitting on the sofa, Rosemary narrowed her sharp eyes.
Miss, tea?
After washing his hands, Marvin had gone to the kitchen to pour her a cup of tea. She reached out for it and held it in her hands. Slightly frowning, she tapped the teacup with her fingertips absent-mindedly. This wasn't the first time she had discussed this with Michael. But in the past, he had always carelessly responded to her. He would still do what he should afterward, and had taken over about half of the Clark family's affairs at one point. He brought them back on track and then handed them back to the rest of the Clark family. This had been the case for the base in the beginning. After half a year of special training, he had risen to be the person in charge of the base. But after teaching a group of people to run the base, he left and went to learn photography. Joshua had been hopping mad, but he still couldn't bear to scold him in the end. Similar things had happened often. It was rumored that he had a wide range of hobbies and acted too arrogantly, so it was difficult for him to be successful in any one thing. Rosemary had also thought so at the beginning, until later. When Joshua was seriously ill, Patrick had taken her to the auction house to see the daylily, a flower that seemed like an alien species. Since then, Joshua's condition had stabilized, and Patrick had instructed her not to spread a word of this. Later, Michael had joined with her to start a company. There were rumors that her methods were extraordinary, but in fact, her methods were worlds apart from Michael's. At least half of the methods she used to obtain unwavering support for herself, she had learned from Michael. She knew that she had changed a lot, and several of the mentors that Michael had found for her would still teach her something new from time to time. She knew better than anyone that if Michael wanted to succeed as the head of the Clark family, as long as he had decided to, nothing was impossible. In the past few years, she had discussed this issue with Michael more than once, but he had only perfunctorily replied to her every time. Only this time, the Clark family still needed a member of the Clark family to inherit. What did this mean? Taking a sip of water, she recalled that when Michael had been brought by Joshua to the Clark family's home for the first time, she had still been underaged. She remembered how good that year had been, and the biggest meteor shower in a century had even appeared. Evanston's layout had changed drastically, and the heads of several big families had developed internationally. When Joshua returned from abroad, he had brought back a 3-year-old boy who looked like a sculpture. He had been in a coma when they arrived, and only woke up 3 days later. Joshua just explained to her and Aaron that this was his youngest son. Rosemary's mother had died during birth, and for many years, Joshua hadn't had a new lover. His sudden 100-fold devotion towards this extra son was unacceptable to Aaron, but acceptable to Rosemary. She had brought Michael up for a period of time, so their relationship was deeper than either's relationship with Aaron. As she drank her cup of tea, Rosemary's mind was filled with thoughts. Her thoughts were jumbled up, and she didn't know where to begin. Putting down her teacup, she turned to Marvin and folded her legs. "Marvin, how did you get recruited by my brother?" Episode 323. Forced to defraud Michael. She didn't know what Patrick did, but judging from his words and demeanor, she realized that he was much more powerful than the elders in her company. "Recruited." Marvin immediately shook his head. He paused and then muttered something hesitantly. "What? Speak louder." Rosemary raised an eyebrow. "I said I was forced by my brother to defraud Michael with a car accident." Marvin exclaimed while blushing. This really piqued Rosemary's interest. She put her chin on her hand and wanted to ask him how he performed this fraud. Marvin remained silent, lowered his head, and continued trimming the flowers. November's weather was very cold. It wasn't a holiday today. Michael parked his car at the intersection and walked for 2 minutes to the school gate. He checked the time on his watch and casually looked up at the school gate, expecting to wait another minute. No matter what time it was, Northwestern University's school gate was crowded. He waited for a minute before seeing the person in the crowd wearing a hoodie. Her half-lowered head seemed impatient, and her black earphone cord could be seen sliding down her white sweater. Winter came early in Evanston. The lowest November temperature dropped to 4 degrees, and many people were wrapped in warm clothes. When she approached him, he pulled her over and pulled off her hoodie. "Are you cold? Where's your coat?" He had gone to deal with some matters last night. When he came back in the morning, she had already gone to school for self-study. Marvin had also gone to find Mary's father in the morning. He lowered his head and pulled off his coat before wrapping it around Bessy. Then he tilted his head at her, pondering for a moment, thinking of how Christopher had taken good care of her last winter. Despite this period of time, he felt that Bertha's worries weren't unfounded. Bessy could really torture herself to death. "It's a little cold now. It wasn't so cold in the morning," she casually replied, reaching out to casually tug at the coat. The school had a heater, so she had worn thinner layers. Glancing silently at her, Michael just let it go, took out the key and lowered his voice. "Bessy, have you considered it?" Gathering the coat around her, Bessy kept her head down and vaguely muttered, "No." Michael chuckled. "Okay." He drove the car back to the Highline Apartments, where Rosemary was still sitting on the sofa, as if thinking about life. When she saw Bessy, her eyes lit up and she gave up thinking about life. "Bessy, I'll take you to a private restaurant today. The food there is absolutely delicious." Bessy casually put her books down on the table. At the top were 2 upside-down pieces of paper. Walking over to take a look, Marvin vaguely saw the word agreement on the paper. Bessy thought about it and apologetically said to Rosemary, "I have an appointment with my teacher today." "Teacher?" Rosemary thought of Mr. Grint subconsciously. "Then can I invite you and Mr. Grint to dinner?" Taking off her coat, Bessy turned to head upstairs to change her clothes. Upon hearing this, she thought for a while and looked up. It's not Mr. Grint. Rosemary only knew that Mr. Grint was Bessy's teacher and had naturally thought of him. She had attended Mr. Grint's apprenticeship banquet and had exchanged a few words with him. They were considered acquaintances. But since Bessy said it wasn't him, she was too embarrassed to invite her to dinner with her teacher. She glanced at her and asked,
"You're going alone?"
Bessy's eyes were cold as ice, and she turned to look at her before vaguely saying,
"You can also—" "Forget it. I don't want to upset your teacher."
Rosemary waved her hand and faintly smiled. It would be rude if she went so rashly. Rosemary had learned etiquette well since she was young and realized she shouldn't follow Bessy. If she went without being invited, Bessy's teacher might be unhappy. Holding a teacup, she watched Bessy go upstairs to change her clothes. After she disappeared on the stairway, she turned to look at Michael, who was going to the kitchen to pour water.
"Are you going too?"
Michael poured out 2 glasses of water, put one on the coffee table, took one for himself, and then casually replied,
"Yes." "Then what kind of teacher is this?"
Rosemary put her hands on the table, her keen and deep eyes thoughtful. After the contest between Mr. Grint and the 2 major departments of Northwestern University, Rosemary felt like she wouldn't even be surprised if Bessy's teacher was the highly reputed Master Soup in Evanston. Without looking up, Michael just lightly said in an audibly cold voice,
"She's only showing respect by calling him a teacher."
Rosemary gave him a confused look.
"After all, he hasn't succeeded in taking the position."
Michael casually put down the porcelain cup. Rosemary was speechless. It sounded a little miserable. Inexplicably, she sympathized with this unqualified teacher of Bessy's. Not long afterward, Bessy came downstairs with a coat. Rosemary checked the time and went downstairs with them without staying for dinner.
"If you become an apprentice, are you holding another apprenticeship banquet?"
Rosemary asked Bessy with her arms folded, smiling casually. If the teacher-to-be was respected in his field and his apprentices had received much attention from society, such an apprenticeship was a rigorous process. The teacher had to show his students importance, or it wouldn't be recognized by the industry. If it was just an ordinary teacher, few people would hold an apprenticeship banquet. Rosemary only casually asked and didn't really expect Bessy to hold one. Reaching out to pull her collar around her, Bessy paused with her finger on her collar, lowered her head and remained silent. Ding! The elevator reached the garage. Rosemary followed Bessy out and Michael walked behind them.
"I heard Patrick mention your midterm exam. It seems like you did well."
Rosemary thought of this and slowly walked beside her.
"Did the dean of your department inform you about the laboratory?"
Yes. Pursing her lips, Bessy circled the big silver button in the middle of her coat with her fingertips. The pattern on the button was vivid and beautiful.
"Really?"
Surprised, Rosemary burst out laughing.
"Then you must work hard. It'll be great if you can enter the laboratory next year. Luke also entered the laboratory in March this year. Yesterday, he was directly promoted to the first research institute, and he's only a sophomore. He's the first person to achieve this at Northwestern University. The first research institute has been making a lot of noise recently. Your schoolmates are quite arrogant."
Bessy was taken aback. Research Institute? The first research institute she had checked on in 129 headquarters, one of the 4 major forces, was under Principal White's supervision. However, Luke hadn't mentioned to them that he had already entered the institute.
"You'll find out after you enter the laboratory."
Rosemary thought Bessy was asking about the research institute and felt it was too cumbersome to explain. She simply said,
"The top priority is to enter the laboratory first, but if you're not from the 4 major families, the assessment is a little difficult."
Normally, the students in the 3rd and 4th years had to pass the screening and strict training of several universities before having the opportunity to be assessed. But Rosemary had disobeyed the family arrangement back then and arrogantly applied for the examination of ordinary people. Naturally, she hadn't passed the exam. The 4 major families' younger generation was quite arrogant. They refused to rely on their families and wanted to get admitted by themselves, but most of them failed in the end. On the other hand, Michael had obeyed the family arrangements back then and had skipped the medical laboratory to directly go to the head research institute. He had left Samuel and Robert behind, even though they were 4 years older than him. After a month of learning there, he'd flown to Austria's medical organization. He only stayed there for half a year. It was rumored that he had finally been driven out by the medical organization. Most of the internal information involving Austria was blocked, so people in Evanston weren't aware of it. Sitting in the car, Rosemary glanced at Michael's car opposite her and shook her head, wondering when Bessy could enter the laboratory. However, judging from how both the deans of two prestigious departments had come all the way to fight for her, she estimated that it wouldn't be difficult for her to enter within a year or two. Fighters attract fighters indeed, she murmured to herself. She started the car and put the memories of her miserable assessment out of her mind. The three parted ways in the garage. Michael slowly drove out of the garage, with Bessy sitting beside him. She had a hand on the door and her cell phone in the other hand as she chatted with Kara. Kara sent a couple of messages in a row. I successfully made an appointment with the players from your high school. They have time after the midterm exam, this Saturday. Have you come back from your holiday? Lazily tapping on her phone, Bessy sent a message in return. Just. Kara replied with a worship picture. You're the first one to ask for a 3-day leave after taking the exam. You're already ridiculously famous, and there are rumors on the school forum that you can enter the physics laboratory early next year. Bessy leaned against the window and ignored Kara's last message. Time and location. Her message was concise and clear, and the coldness could almost be felt rushing through the phone. Kara immediately understood that she was asking about the meeting location. Startled, she sat upright and then quickly replied. At 10 a.m., Maple and Ash Restaurant. Kai and the others are coming too. Okay, Bessy replied, and then turned off the phone. 10 minutes later, the car parked in a quiet clubhouse. Michael followed after Bessy. A lifelike orchard was carved on the second-floor door. Bessy slowly knocked 3 times. Then the door opened from inside. It was Principal White. With reading glasses on the bridge of his nose, he saw Michael standing behind Bessy and paused for a moment, before turning sideways to let them in. The two had made an appointment, so the dishes had only just arrived when Bessy came. She greeted Principal White and sat down to eat. Principal White allowed her to eat first while he chatted with Michael about the recent abnormalities in Evanston. When Bessy had finished eating, he turned to look at her.
How's your preparation for the assessment?
Episode 324. The successor Mr. White had chosen. I'm not ready yet. She squeezed her right hand. Pausing with the fork in his hand, Principal White glanced at her right hand and slowly said,
There's no rush. We still have a month. Take your time.
He had already received an internal report on Bessy's midterm exams. Nuclear engineering involved many details and could not be replaced by mechanical labor, regardless of how insignificant and small the parts or roots were. A slight error in the operation would cause an explosion or even more serious things. In some departments, the Research Institute only had a few master craftsmen, whose work could be extremely demanding on their dominant hand. This was the reason why Principal White had been so worried about Bessy's hand in Chicago. Looking away, he picked up the teacup and took a sip. Casually taking a piece of waffles, she looked at him with clear, light eyes and very simply replied, Okay. She had been warming up to the idea of becoming his successor, but Principal White had yet to receive an accurate reply and was worrying about his losses. After finally receiving her reply, he felt this weight lift off of his mind.
Good, good.
He held the teacup with trembling fingers.
Mr. White.
Michael took the teacup and added tea to it. The tea in the teacup swayed in circles.
There'll be a battle in the White family following this.
He meant because the White family's force, the Research Institute, would be handed over to an outsider, not the White family. The masses couldn't always be convinced, be it the White family or the Research Institute. But Mr. White didn't care about this. He lifted his chin and glanced at Michael displeasedly.
The successor I choose is naturally the best.
Even Kenneth had been crossed off by him, so how could such an heir who had been selected out of thousands of people possibly go wrong?
Luke went to the Research Institute yesterday.
Principal White glanced at Bessy, tapping his fingers on the table.
It took him 14 months to get from Northwestern University to the Research Institute. In 7 months, take the assessment in experimental engineering seriously. At the end of March next year, try to enter the Institute and let the self-righteous masters there take a good look at you. Who dares to say no to the successor I accepted?
Principal White had already paved the way for Bessy. Swiping her fingertips across the edge of the cup, Bessy's eyes lightened. Entering the institute was also her ultimate goal. Upon hearing Principal White's advice, she nodded. I know. Luke told me.
He told you as well?
Principal White thought of something, and the corners of his mouth slightly twitched.
No wonder.
No wonder Luke stepped on the masters of the laboratory so wildly. It seemed he had come prepared. This pair, they had the right to be arrogant. Principal White and Luke both knew Bessy's personality. She was impatient and didn't like troublesome things, so she was casual about everything. Both of them were afraid that she would take this matter lightly and had especially reminded her to treat this matter more seriously. In a good mood, Principal White drank 2 glasses of wine with Michael. They were only to drink 2 glasses before Bessy seized the pitcher. The 2 people standing at the top of the pyramid in Evanston's circle stared at the pitcher in her hands and didn't dare to ask her for it. Principal White didn't drink much and only had a bit of alcohol sent on him. It was already midnight when the driver took him to the White family's house. The butler bowed and said,
Kenneth is waiting for you in the study.
Principal White turned and walked into the study.
Grandpa.
Kenneth slightly pursed his lips.
When are you going to announce your successor?
He had already guessed about Bessy, so Principal White hadn't hidden why he went out today.
In March next year.
Principal White sat down and reached out to take the tea from the butler.
After she enters the institute.
He turned on the computer, sorted out a copy of the assessment content, opened his mailbox, and sent it to Bessy. There were certain things that Bessy understood without the need for Principal White to tell her. Standing opposite him, Kenneth stared at him, and his cold expression gradually turned into a frown. He slightly pursed his thin lips.
Grandpa, if you want the majority in the institute to recognize her, let her enter it with her own capabilities and convince others with her strength.
Bessy was no less capable than Luke. Kenneth felt like she could definitely pass the assessment with her own ability, and didn't need to rely on Principal White's shortcut. This shortcut would only harm her instead of doing good. If she entered based on his grandpa's prestige, even if she was recognized by him, a large number of people in the institute would be against her. Only those who climbed up step by step with true ability could be recognized, like his grandpa, like Luke. Kenneth used to think that, like his grandpa, he could be the heir of the first research institute and take over the White family without the help of outsiders. But this step was too difficult, and Principal White had chosen someone else. It was almost mid-November now, less than 5 months until March of the following year. Bessy hadn't entered Northwestern University's laboratory yet, let alone the research institute. Upon hearing this, Kenneth subconsciously believed that Bessy would be aided by Principal White to join the research institute in March. The butler, Norman, stood quietly, his head hanging down, not participating in their conversation. Principal White took a sip of the hangover tea that Norman had given him. He looked up and lightly said to Kenneth,
I won't interfere.
Kenneth's eyes were full of complex emotions.
You're really not going to interfere?
So she had to get in by herself? He only knew that her qualities were good, but as for how good she was, he didn't know. Upon hearing Principal White's words, he was rather shocked.
Is that too harsh?
Principal White finished his tea and waved his hand for them to go out. They left, and the butler respectfully closed the door. Standing in the corridor without a jacket, a cold wind blew past Kenneth, sobering him.
Norman, do you think she can do it?
Kenneth pursed his lips. Norman didn't really know the successor that Mr. White had chosen and only dared to hesitantly say,
It took a year for the talented Luke to enter the institute. Master only said it was possible, not confirmed.
In March next year, the difficulty was too high. If she could pass the exam with her own capabilities, she would be able to stun those people in the research institute without using Principal White. Norman and Kenneth were thinking about the possibility of this matter, but they didn't know that in the study, Principal White was staring at the Research Institute's page and shaking his head. March. Was it too much? In the research base in Fairfield, Bessy had already met the internal requirements 4 years ago. He didn't think it was asking too much of her to climb up again by March of the following year. She was born for this, and if not for the bombing incident, she wouldn't have waited these 4 years to go to Northwestern University. Fortunately, he could afford to wait. At the same time, Bessy was talking to Luke about the Research Institute in her room. She opened her email and checked the documents sent by Principal White. Luke already knew about this matter, and upon hearing that Principal White had arranged an event for her in March next year, he directly sent a message.
Wait a little while.
Bessy waited while reading books on nuclear engineering. About half an hour later, she received another oversized document from him, with a total of 3 gigabytes.
Look through it carefully.
Downloading it directly, she opened the folder and took a look, only to find that it was full of laboratory videos recorded by Luke for Jerome. After Luke had arrived at the Research Institute, Jerome was a free man. At this time, the videos were just right for Bessy, who had yet to enter. As soon as she finished the first 10 minutes of video, Tucker called her. Turning off the external speaker, she picked up her earphones and put them on. She leaned back and asked, with narrowed eyes, "What's the matter?"
Uncle got me a few teachers today.
Tucker was squatting in the bathroom with his hand over his mouth, lowering his voice. Bessy wasn't too surprised and casually asked, "You showed him the games?"
You said it was all right to show him.
Tucker's long eyelashes hung down, and his voice was a little soft. Yeah. Bessy stared at the screen and distractedly said, "Learn well from the teachers, and ask me if you don't understand anything, but I might not have time later on, so I'll introduce you to the person who taught me before." Tucker's eyes dimmed upon hearing that she wasn't planning on teaching him, and he muttered a faint affirmative reply. After hanging up the phone, Bessy continued watching the videos. As she did, she clicked on the Neighbor Twitter profile in her friends list. She sent his number directly to Tucker, asking him to add him quickly. Then she left a message to Neighbor. "My brother is adding you." She was about to send the message, but after thinking about it, she clicked on her message and changed the comma to a full stop. On his end, Tucker got Bessy's message saying that her teacher was going to teach him, and he sat upright on the toilet seat. He immediately added the teacher respectfully. The teacher seemed very taciturn. He only sent a short message.
"Shoot if you have any questions."
Nothing else. Putting away his cell phone, Tucker left the bathroom. He filmed the reality show during the day and studied with his teachers during his free time. His rapid progress amazed the teachers. Upon hearing about his progress from the teachers, Zeke became more and more hopeful for the Miller family's revival. After Jack found out about this as well, he relaxed his strict education for James. He had been forceful towards James because he was the only one in the direct line. But now that there was the talented Tucker, he didn't force James as much. Other than teaching him some basic things, he didn't force him to watch code software or similar things. And so, after the Miller siblings separated in Hawaii, they both fell into a frantic study. Episode 325, A Group of Gamers. It was Saturday. Bessy was woken up by a call from Kara, reminding her that today was the day to meet her high school classmates. Bessy had gone to bed at 2 o'clock last night after watching the videos from Luke and reading books. She opened her eyes and sat on the bed for a while, then slowly got up, brushed her teeth, washed her face, changed her clothes, and went downstairs. Michael had just come in after his morning practice. He wore a white long-sleeved shirt that the cold weather had left a layer of frost on. His beautiful eyes casually squinted, and he lazily blinked when he saw Bessy coming downstairs.
"What time are you leaving?"
9:30. Bessy didn't sleep well these days. She pulled the chair out and sat down with her chin on her hand. They were meeting at a place near Northwestern University, and it took less than 20 minutes to drive there. Seeing that he had the time, Michael went up to take a bath, changed his clothes, and then ate breakfast with Bessy before driving her to the restaurant. He parked the car in front of the restaurant. Instead of going in with her, he only asked her to call him before leaving the venue. Kara, Kai, and Gary had arrived 20 minutes earlier. "Bessy, you're here." Kara looked up and moved over so Bessy could sit. "Here." Taking off her coat and hanging it aside, Bessy sat down beside her, then leaned lazily back in the chair while casually chatting with them. 2 minutes later, someone knocked on the door. Kara's eyes lit up, and she couldn't help but grab Bessy's arms excitedly. Can I finally see the woman with so many stars? Kai stood up immediately and excitedly opened the door. Outside, Mary was standing beside Paul, her hands on the door, about to knock for the third time when Kai opened the door. She didn't expect the people inside to be so enthusiastic.
Hello.
Wearing a black cap, Paul's hands were in his pockets, and he greeted Kai with a very sunny smile. Kai moved aside and bowed.
Hello, great god.
Don't call me that. Moving past him, Paul smirked.
I'm not some great god.
You have 2 stars at the supreme level. How could you not be a great god? Kara said as Kai sat down. Kai nodded frantically beside her. Everyone in the group was on at least the guru level, and almost all of them had a few stars each. To Kai and Kara, who were 2 levels below them, they were certainly amazing. They were god-level players. Paul just raised an eyebrow and glanced at Bessy. Bessy knocked on the table frivolously, her eyebrows raised. Order the food. Kai immediately pressed the service bell and asked the waiter for the first round of food. The group was very familiar on the internet, but were a little awkward in the beginning after meeting in person for the first time. Fortunately, the awkwardness disappeared after the food was served.
Is everyone in your class great game gods?
Opening a can of beer, Kai toasted with Paul.
Except for the few who don't play games, how can everyone else have such a high level?
Kai and the others knew that the dozen people in the group were all from the same class. Speaking of this, Kai glanced at Mary and gave her a thumbs up.
You have the most stars.
Lowering her head to eat, Mary knew after playing with Kara on the internet for so long that Bessy hadn't told her about the stars, so she just faintly said, A friend got me to that level. Why don't I have such a friend? Kara took a sip of water and then turned to Bessy. Bessy, don't you play games? Don't just be a beautiful nerd. Let's play games together. Let Paul and the others bring you along. I'm just a rookie, but they managed to promote me to the guru level. But no one dares to bring me to the supreme level. Everyone in the group had their username written as game level plus name. Kara had also found Bessy, but her username was just her name, without the game level. Because she and Kai had been brought in by Bessy, several technical gods in the group had brought them to the guru level using their stars. But as for the supreme level, the others were afraid of losing points and didn't dare to lead them along that far. The difficulty of the advancement in the game wasn't simple, and even if they had the stars, they didn't have the skills to bring them up to the supreme level. Speaking of this, Kara glanced at Paul and Mary with dim eyes. When will the friend you mentioned have time to bring me to the supreme level? Bessy lowered her head and ate without speaking. She didn't want to experience the annoyance of being badgered by her class to play games during the summer vacation. That was why she had dragged Kara into the group. Paul leaned back in his chair and laughed.
You might have to wait for the end of term.
Okay, Kara nodded regretfully. I haven't even seen the friend you're talking about in the game. How big was this friend whom the god-level class recognized? After finishing their meal, Kara and Kai took Mary and the others to the Science and Technology department. Seeing how well they were getting along, Bessy didn't go with them and went back to read instead. She sent a message to Michael, then put on her windbreaker. Instead of buttoning it up, she just casually pulled her scarf to cover her chin and lazily put her earphones in. She stuck her hands in her pocket and waited for his car at the side of the road. Her fingers played with the black headphone cable, shining like jade. Screech! A black car stopped in front of her. She looked up. It wasn't Michael's car. When the car window was lowered, the first thing she saw was the slender fingers hanging on the steering wheel. The guy at the wheel tilted his head and smiled. His picturesque eyes resembling lake water rippled by the spring breeze. They made everything around him seem less colorful. Bessy glanced briefly at him and politely nodded. Alejandro,
do you have time?
He put his fingers on the steering wheel, smiling widely. Pausing, she glanced past the car at the cafe diagonally opposite. Let's go there. Alejandro glanced at the opposite side of the road, and a trace of surprise crossed his face, but he nodded.
Okay.
He parked the car. Bessy had already chosen a seat when he entered the cafe. Seeing that she had chosen the noisy seat by a glass window near the street, Alejandro paused, lowered his eyes and walked over. Today was a holiday, so several people were in the coffee shop, and most of them were students from the university town. Bessy pulled her scarf up to cover her chin. Alejandro ordered a cup of coffee and a latte for her. It was served soon after, and he stirred the coffee with a spoon. glancing at Bessy with a pair of clear eyes and a smile.
Sure enough, just as Mr. Bright said. Bessy, you've changed a lot.
While holding a latte in both hands, she glanced at the side of the road through the glass window but didn't see a familiar car. She looked away and raised an eyebrow frivolously. Something happened to the consortium? As always, she was straight to the point.
No, I just saw that your Twitter bio had changed.
Alejandro glanced at her, her reflection shining in his clear eyes.
It's good that you've put it down.
Bessy was taken aback, surprised that he had paid attention to this. Pulling off the scarf and letting it hang casually around her neck, she took a sip of her latte.
Thanks. No need to be polite with me.
He shook his head, leaned back in his chair and stared at her. His pale eyes were dappled with light and shadow.
You should know that I've always allowed you in the World Poker Tour, but don't want you to be involved in Austria.
Upon hearing this, Bessy's eyelashes drooped and she narrowed her beautiful eyes. She casually nodded, supporting her chin with her hand.
We're too complicated in Austria.
Alejandro paused. His face suddenly turned pale at the thought of something.
Some people have died in the slums unknowingly. We searched the whole of Austria and still couldn't find some bodies.
Emotionless, she crossed her legs and smiled at him. That's really pitiful.
Indeed.
Alejandro's eyelashes trembled, and he looked up again, regaining his previous gentle expression.
So, do you think you can handle it?
Bessy looked up. What?
The person outside the window isn't so simple in Austria either,
said Alejandro casually as he stirred the coffee with his small spoon. He glanced out the window next to them.
Can you handle it?
Bessy turned sideways, looked out the window, and saw Michael standing on the opposite side of the road. His eyes were clear and cold. Bessy, who had always been calm, held the cup tightly at this moment, her sharp brows furrowing slightly.
He's in line with your aesthetic.
Alejandro knew the answer just by looking at her and chuckled softly. Bessy paused and glanced at him.
Go out. Don't let him wait too long.
He reached out to close the lid of her latte, looking at her with soft eyes. Taking the latte, she got up to say goodbye to him and then left the coffee shop. Just a minute after she left, another person sat down in the chair she'd just vacated. Mr. Cheatham took off his headset, put his phone on the table and glanced at Alejandro.
Mr. Schuler, why bother?
Having known each other for so many years, Mr. Cheatham always knew how well Alejandro took care of Bessy. Alejandro looked away, his cold fingertips gripping the coffee spoon. Hearing this, his gaze relaxed, and he looked rather frustrated. After a pause, he said,
I can't kill another person.
Huh? Mr. Cheatham didn't understand. Adding sugar to his coffee, Alejandro took a sip, but it was still bitter. He put down the cup and said,
Let's go.
He didn't explain himself. Outside the cafe, Michael was still standing there when Bessy walked out. The pedestrians walking back and forth were just silhouettes to him. His delicate eyebrows were lazy as he stared at her through the crowd. His figure was slender, and he stood out from everyone, as always. Episode 326. Joshua and Rosemary pay a visit. Bessy approached him, raised her head and subconsciously said,
I know.
Lowering his head, Michael's fine eyelashes drooped, covering his dark pupils. He wrapped her in the scarf again.
The car's at the intersection.
His tone was casual as always. Bessy followed him, glancing sideways at him. They walked to the side of the car, and she watched as he opened the passenger door while she took a sip of her latte. Michael waited for her to get into the car before walking to the driver's seat. Bessy held the drink in her right hand and fastened the seatbelt casually with her left. He opened the door on the driver's seat, got in, and then closed it with a bang. Before she could fasten her seatbelt, he caught her hand and held it down. She looked up instinctively. The car was only so big. He leaned over, making it even more cramped. Pressing her left hand with one hand, he held her closer with the other. Their breath intertwined, and he smiled.
Bessy, have you considered it yet?
His fingertips around her waist tightened, and instead of waiting for her answer, he muttered,
You must have.
The corners of his mouth curled up, and his voice turned low, but it was inexplicably husky. The air in the vehicle was thin and dry. Bessy's senses seemed to become countless times more sensitive. She could clearly feel the hand clasped around her waist and vaguely feel his heat. He stared at her closely, his eyes dark and bright, gentle and serious, as if reflecting snow. He wasn't pressing down too hard on her left hand, so she slightly moved it and broke free with a slight twist. Without saying a single word, she held his hand, as if giving the only response she could. Lowering his eyelashes, he stared at her through them with a pair of clear eyes. He didn't think he would get any response from her now. It was really killing him. He lowered his head. Joshua and Rosemary had come to the Highline Apartments. They had chosen a time when Bessy wasn't in class to come visit her. Bessy had gone to see her classmates, so they sat on the sofa, calmly waiting for her. Rosemary leaned on the sofa and lowered her head to play games on her phone. Joshua stood at the side, asking Marvin about Bessy's recent situation. While making tea in the kitchen, Marvin meticulously answered,
Miss Miller has been studying all the time. She basically goes to bed after midnight.
After a pause, he continued,
She's even reading while eating.
Upon hearing this, Joshua frowned worriedly and sighed.
Why is she working so hard?
Simons looked at Joshua and thought of Bessy in Chicago. He paused, but still didn't tell Joshua the truth. Back then, Bessy hadn't done anything pragmatic other than playing games. She would even help Officer Gomez and the others track down some cases in her free time. Hearing Marvin speak of Bessy as being hard-working, Simons felt like he was daydreaming. What was Miss Miller doing again? As he thought about this, a voice came from the hallway. He looked up to see Bessy and Michael. Michael lazily changed his shoes and casually greeted Joshua. Ignoring him, Joshua reached out to adjust his clothes, and his face eased as he turned to Bessy.
Aren't you tired from studying lately? Do you want to go out next week? Rosemary said you liked places with a sense of age. A new local garden in the neighboring province has just been developed.
Taking off her scarf, Bessy put it on the sofa beside her. She calculated the time and apologetically glanced at Joshua. I might not be able to go anytime soon. You'll have to wait for me when I'm free. The Northwestern University Laboratory Assessment was just around the corner. Principal White and Luke both paid so much attention to it that she couldn't relax. Many things had to be prepared.
Okay.
Joshua regretfully nodded and planned to come back to find her after a while. Rosemary bent down to pick up a cup of water, smiling at Bessy.
Ignore my dad. Has your dean been preparing you for the Northwestern University Laboratory Assessment in March next year? Miss, why are you telling Miss Miller this now?
Simon smiled and glanced at her.
Miss Miller is only in her first year, so don't put too much pressure on her.
Simons remembered how crazy Rosemary had been because of the ordinary examination. She had been a mess. Michael unbuttoned his windbreaker with his fingers and turned to Bessy.
Go upstairs and read.
She politely nodded to them, took her mobile phone, and went to study. When her figure had disappeared, Joshua sat down and took the tea from the kitchen. Upon hearing Rosemary's words, his slightly muddy eyes had narrowed. Unlike them, he knew that President Flores had fought with the University of Chicago for Bessy for resources in the first place. With Bessy's qualifications, it was only a matter of time before she entered the laboratory. Holding his tea, he glanced at Simons.
Didn't a sophomore just join the institute? We have to prepare early.
Simons was speechless. Who was the one who said a few days ago that President Flores would let Miss Miller enter the institute in 2 years, but now he was singing a different tune? Joshua was a little too biased. After speaking, Joshua took a sip of tea calmly, then looked at Michael, his face stern.
Why haven't you come home?
No reason to.
Michael took off his coat and sat opposite Joshua. He leaned on the sofa, his eyes light. Usually he wouldn't bother explaining himself, but today he was in a good mood, so he carefully explained.
The Clark family must have many people looking for me now. It's not convenient for me to go back.
He didn't continue talking about why it was inconvenient, but Joshua already guessed. Because of the security guard in Hawaii, Michael had become famous in the Clark family. If he went back, the Clark family would flock to him and more people would support him, hence why he felt it was inconvenient. Putting the teacup down, he turned to look at Michael with his lips pursed. A light sorrow appeared in his eyes.
You probably know better than me that Bessy will definitely enter the Institute in a few years. The Research Institute isn't simply an institute anymore. Too many forces are influencing it. More than 1 or 2 of the research results have been robbed and driven out of the Institute. That's why the White family's stronghold. And no one will listen to the Clark family's 3rd son about it when the time comes. Can you handle it?
Michael tilted his head back, chuckled softly, and said in a somewhat calm voice,
"Don't worry about it."
Joshua was speechless. He really wanted to smack him. When it was dinner time, Joshua and Rosemary had their dinner there. Joshua and Bessy made an appointment to go out together next time before Joshua went back home with Rosemary. Behind him, Michael stared at Joshua and Rosemary's backs. After a long while, he took out his phone and casually played with his phone. The phone screen lit up. If Bessy had been next to him in that moment, she would have definitely noticed that his mobile browser was on 129's official website. In Hawaii, at 5:30 a.m. that same day, the production team ended work ahead of schedule. They had already become accustomed to it by now. Katie came over to hug Tucker and kissed him fiercely.
"You and your sister are really so precious."
She released him and happily walked upstairs. Back inside, she put on a face mask. Her phone rang and she picked it up. It was a producer she knew. "What's the matter?" She sat down on the chair next to the computer and turned on her phone. The producer greeted her before talking about what happened.
"Katie, do you know Ava? I want to ask you for a favor."
The producer's theme song had yet to be finalized. Recently, Ava had appeared on the Hot Search, and her composition from her homepage had been discovered by insiders. The producer had taken a fancy to her music to use as his theme song. He wanted to buy the copyright and then put it in his new movie with a little modification as a song for publicity. The main thing was that Ava was a rookie and wasn't a singer, so it didn't cost much to buy the copyright. Since it was relatively cheap and also fitted the movie, it was best for the crew. But Ava had never responded. He had directly contacted Katie after seeing her interact with Ava. The producer had only worked with Katie once, and she was considered more famous in the circle. Katie also wanted to help Ava out with this, so she went to talk to Ava about it. Ava had always respected Katie, Zeke, and her other seniors. If Katie had approached her earlier, she might have sold the copyright. But after Noah's reminder, "Katie, I won't sell the copyright for this composition." Ava apologetically glanced at her. Behind her, Miss Lee motioned for Ava to agree and almost convulsed. Surprised that she didn't want to sell it, Katie was taken aback for a moment, but she respected her decision and left after speaking a few more words with her. After Katie left, Miss Lee glanced at Ava. "Are you stupid? Forget it if it's a couple thousand, but now that you're not even selling it for $50,000, and it's a film by a producer in the industry. Although it's a literary film, selling it will help you a lot." She was trying to persuade her. "Bessy helped me to revise this piece of composition, and Noah advised me not to sell it." Ava lazily looked up and took a bite of an apple. Upon hearing Bessy and Noah's names, Miss Lee paused, and immediately changed her tune. "Then don't sell it." After a pause, she sat down and glanced at Ava. "Why would Noah care about your composition?" Looking down, she thought about Bessy and Noah's relationship and seemed to form a link between them. But it was too unbelievable. Downstairs, Zeke and Tucker returned to their rooms after eating. The teacher who taught Tucker was already sitting at the table with computers and books. After listening to his explanation, Tucker turned on the computer. The teacher glanced at him, then lowered his voice and signaled Zeke to go outside with him. Zeke closed the door and respectfully asked,
"What is it?"
Episode 327. Did Northwestern University make a mistake?
Tucker's talent is beyond my expectation. It's the first time I've taught someone who understands something after being taught it only once."
Tucker's teacher looked at the door and exclaimed involuntarily,
"In at most a month, I won't have anything new to teach him. You'll have to get ready to find a new teacher."
Zeke was stunned. He had already expected Tucker to be talented, but he didn't expect the teacher to speak so highly of him. There used to be many technical masters in the Miller family, but now they had all joined the fourth son's side, so Zeke could only find credible people outside the family. Zeke could trust only a limited number of people, and if he looked further, he was afraid that the news about him seeking out the Master of Engineering and the news about Tucker would be exposed.
"Thank you, teacher."
Zeke gathered his thoughts and began to ponder about this problem that would occur in the following month. The show had already filmed for half the episodes, and Zeke's future schedule had yet to be determined. Looking down at his mobile phone, he saw that his manager had already sent him several movie scripts. He scrolled down and finally found on a script that was shooting in Austria. He tapped on it with relaxed eyes. The fourth son could only intervene domestically, but what about Austria? Pursing his lips, he put away his phone and returned to his room. On Monday, Dean Soup was slowly drinking tea in his office. At this moment, Dr. Weatherby hurriedly entered, his face anxious.
"Sit."
Now that Luke had appeared in the Science and Technology department, he had gained another prestigious student this year. Dean Soup tapped his fingers slowly at the sight of Dr. Weatherby.
"Why are you so anxious? You must behave calmly, like a professor." "Was it you who submitted Bessy's papers for the assessment at the beginning of next month?"
Dr. Weatherby's face was dark. Dean Soup paused, and the smile on his face instantly disappeared.
"Bessy's name has been submitted?"
Be it the ordinary assessment for ordinary students, or the one for the 4 major families. They only had one try. If they failed, they would lose the opportunity to enter the laboratory forever, regardless of whether they were an ordinary student or from a member of the 4 major families. Rosemary had failed the ordinary assessment at the beginning of her studies, and thus failed to enter the institute. Therefore, major universities very seriously selected people for the assessment every year. When students were asked to sign confidentiality agreements or guarantees, they would always confirm that the student's basic knowledge of various experiments were top-notch before signing them up. This list was also obtained from the Science and Technology Department's meeting assessment. Now that there were fewer and fewer professional talents, the Science and Technology Department wasn't doing it for the resources, but also to train a few Northwestern University students who could challenge the laboratory and even the research institute. Over the years, many students from Northwestern University had entered the laboratory, but only a few of them emerged as leaders, and those leaders had all come from the University of Chicago. Because of this, Northwestern University's status was in jeopardy, which is why President Flores was so persistent about the annual top scorer. At present, Luke had come out first, followed by Bessy. Every teacher in Northwestern University's Science and Technology department valued both of them very much. Several doctors and professors of the Science and Technology department had seen Bessy's final exam results for computer science and had even held several meetings about it. Many doctors were transferred to the laboratory to help Bessy. Because Luke preceded her, the dean and the others had already created a complete plan for her. Dean Soup originally wanted to ask Bessy to do some assessment questions during the winter vacation. If she was confident and wasn't worse than Luke, she could start experimenting with the laboratory's photoelectric nuclear magnetic experiments. Dean Soup had reported her to the laboratory for March of the following year. The Science and Technology department was full of expectations for Bessy and Luke. They were very serious about their future, for fear that they would take the wrong step. He had properly arranged it according to plan, and upon hearing Dr. Weatherby's words, he felt like he was hit by 5 thunderstorms at once. Bessy had never even touched the content of the assessment, much less the major experiments. Dean Soup didn't plan on letting her take the assessment so early. Only half a month was left to prepare for the experiments, not to mention the theoretical questions for the assessment. Bessy was simply too busy for the photoelectric nuclear magnetic experiment. If she failed this time, she wouldn't have any chance next year. Realizing the seriousness of this matter, Dean Soup sat upright, picked up the phone on the desk, and called the person in charge of the laboratory. When the person in charge heard Dean Soup's intentions, he was taken aback.
The application from your school was submitted by President Flores. I asked the assistant to call him and confirm it several times. It's such a big thing. Could he have made an error?
It was the president after all. No wonder he had directly registered for Bessy. Dean Soup suppressed the anger in his voice and asked in a low voice,
President Flores didn't discuss it with me. Can I revoke Bessy's application? The confidentiality agreement and the application form have been applied. You know how strict the laboratory's regulations are, even for the Clark family.
The person in charge shook his head. Then he hung up the call. Dean Soup sat down in his chair. Standing by his desk, Dr. Weatherby turned to look at Dean Soup and understood it from his expression.
Is it my dad?
The person in charge of the laboratory had spoken loudly, and Dr. Weatherby had heard it clearly. He pursed his lips.
Does he need to be so eager for quick success? It's rare to see such a genius like Bessy, but he placed a bet on her future just because of his laughable performance resources.
Upon hearing this, Dean Soup sat upright in low spirits.
President Flores isn't someone who would randomly make decisions. Bessy is smart. Given half a month, she'll definitely pass the theory test. There are still experiments after the theory test. If she can't pass that part, then...
He looked out the window. In less than a month, even if he decided to train only Bessy, time was simply too tight. As Dean Soup said, Bessy would definitely pass the theory test given half a month. Her talent was extraordinary, and it was precisely because of this that Dr. Weatherby was more distressed. Dr. Weatherby's face was gloomy. He wondered whether the man was an undercover agent sent by the University of Chicago. Dean Soup managed to cheer himself up. He picked up the phone to call Bessy and asked her to come to the office. No matter what, her application had been submitted, so the Science and Technology Department wouldn't give up on her. Bessy was still reading in the library. Answering the call, she walked out into the corridor. Dean Soup?
Bessy, where are you now?
Dean Soup's voice seemed a little weak.
Library.
She put her hands on the windowsill and glanced out over the campus, her voice calm. Dean Soup paused and mildly said,
Come to my office for a while.
At the same time, on the second underground floor of the laboratory, the person in charge hung up the phone, looking confused. Having heard the same thing, the assistant beside him cautiously asked,
Did Northwestern University make a mistake? They said that they reported the name wrongly and made a huge mistake. The Science and Technology Department didn't know that President Flores had submitted the name of their queen.
The person in charge pushed his glasses up his nose and shook his head.
No wonder. I was wondering why this queen reported her name so early. The Science and Technology Department shouldn't be in such a hurry. It has only been 2 months since she was enrolled. And she can't possibly have done many experiments.
The assistant pulled out an audit form from the desk, which showed Bessy's midterm exam results.
She got full marks in the midterm exam and has unlimited potential.
Shaking his head, the person in charge slightly sighed.
What a pity.
On the other side of campus, Dean Soup had arranged an experimental classroom in the Science and Technology Department. He and the other professors had also sorted out the assessment content. The printer was still printing when Bessy arrived at the office. Seeing Dr. Weatherby, she held her book in one hand and politely greeted them. Dean Soup, Dr. Weatherby. Standing by the printer with a stapler in his hand, Dean Soup waited for all the papers to be printed before sorting them out. He lowered his eyes and handed. Episode 328. The Sea Level Experiment. Bessy didn't really have a sense of belonging to Northwestern University. She had only come here because Scarlett and Luke happened to be here. She let out a deep breath at the sight of Dean Soup now. She didn't say much to Dean Soup. She hadn't done experiments for more than 4 years and didn't know how difficult the experiments in the laboratory were. Even Luke was so serious about it, so she didn't know if she could reach Dean Soup's requirements. She took the keycard given to her and went to a small classroom in the complex, where a bunch of experiment equipment was placed. No one was in the laboratory, so she chose a small reactor and started experimenting. At 7 p.m., Michael parked the car outside the Science and Technology building. He arrived at 7 p.m. exactly. But Bessy hadn't come down yet. Raising an eyebrow, he turned off the car, turned on his phone, and glanced at the classroom location Bessy had sent him just now. He walked directly into the building and to the small classroom. The classroom was in the innermost corner of the 3rd floor and was very quiet. The door was ajar, and through the white doorframe and transparent glass, he could see Bessy standing at the experimental table. Her fingertips held a closed metal magnetic container with a circle of threads on the outside. She carefully placed a glass cover over the complex structure with one hand. With her eyebrows lowered, her long eyelashes could be seen hanging down from this angle. The shadows fell on her eyelids, and her eyebrows were furrowed. Her eyes were the only bright color in the laboratory. Michael knew that she was doing an experiment, so he didn't go in to disturb her. He only walked 2 steps forward, his long legs casually striding across the corridor, stopping at the window and placing his 2 hands on the windowsill. His dark eyes held a hint of amusement as he stared intensely at her. Bessy had always been very serious about experiments. She focused on the changes in the small reactor, picked up the pen and the log file beside her, and recorded the data. She recorded the time. It was 7:30 p.m. Subconsciously, she glanced outside the door. Michael was at the window, his eyebrows jade-like and his figure slender.
Why are you doing experiments?
Michael raised the temperature of the air conditioner in the car. Bessy asked him to turn on the car lights, then lowered her head and turned over the data she had just recorded. The first time the reactor hadn't been successful, and the energy had been as she had expected. Leaning back in her chair, she said in a nasal voice, "Lab assessment." She flipped through the recorded data while talking. Whenever she encountered difficulties, she sent a message to the professor of nuclear engineering. The nuclear engineering professor was revising his SCI papers. The social media messenger in the lower right corner of the computer popped out, and the professor opened it to see that it was Bessy, the Science and Technology Department's new student. After adding her so long ago, Bessy had hardly asked him any questions. The professor put down his paper, opened her chat, and looked at the questions she asked. He was 50 years old and had been in the laboratory for more than 20 years, so he was familiar with the contents of the experiment. Soon, he understood the problem and quickly sent an answer to her. After confirming that she had no other problems, he continued with his thesis. He had just revised a few lines before he realized that something was wrong.
That's strange.
The professor opened Bessy's chat log and read it several times before murmuring,
Isn't this the sea-level experiment?
At home, Michael parked his car in the underground parking lot. The Highline Apartments parking lot was very large, with 2 very wide floors and lights that weren't dim even at night. There were 4 elevators in the building, and almost all the residents owned 1 or 2 floors, so the elevators weren't busy. Michael held Bessy's nuclear engineering book in one hand and pressed the elevator button with the other. Bessy followed behind him, holding her phone, looking down at the explanation given to her by the professor. She looked extremely serious and absent-mindedly pondered where she had gone wrong. The elevator reached the garage floor. Ding! The door opened, and there was nobody inside. They got in. Looking sideways at her, Michael reached out to clasp her waist and pull her towards him. He calmly pressed the floor button.
Bessy.
Bessy already guessed his intention. She casually raised her head and calmly said, "Go on." Michael lowered his head, tightened his arm around her waist, and pressed his cool lips on hers. The hand clasping her waist was hot. He didn't kiss her for long. It was less than a minute. Michael's lips moved aside, but his lips were still pressed against the corner of her mouth. His breath slightly unstable, with lowered eyes and dark pupils, he slowly and calmly said, "We've arrived." Ding! The elevator reached its floor. Inside the house, Marvin had already prepared the food. No one came over for dinner today except Marvin and Patrick. After the group finished eating, Patrick took an envelope to find Michael. Michael was flipping through another pile of papers and without looking up, he said,
Put it down on the desk.
Patrick nodded and glanced at him before realizing he had the exam questions from the laboratory in his hands.
This is...
He was taken aback. Instead of asking Michael, he stepped aside and asked Marvin, who was making tea.
Miss Miller will take the assessment to enter the laboratory next March?
Marvin poured water into the cup before carefully counting 7 tea leaves. He answered without looking up.
No.
That's good. Patrick lowered his voice and glanced at Michael.
I thought Miss Miller was crazy enough to take the assessment in March.
Patrick had also taken part in the laboratory assessment before. Other than Alexander, all of them had suffered defeat. Seeing that Marvin had finished brewing the tea, he directly took the tea from his hands and was about to find Bessy and Michael. Marvin's voice sounded expressionless.
Miss Miller is participating in the assessment next month.
Patrick immediately paused. Marvin glanced at him, then calmly took the cup from his hand. He walked to Bessy and carefully placed the teacup in front of her. Bessy was watching the laboratory video, which Marvin glanced at and couldn't understand. Walking over to Michael, he saw that he was looking at the theoretical data that the dean had compiled for Bessy. He seemed to be assessing the system and scope. Marvin took a look and realized that the laboratory examination was divided into 2 rounds: the theory and the experimental examinations. The number of people assessed by Northwestern University and the University of Chicago accounted for 1/3 of the applicants, while the 4 major families shared the remaining segment with the other domestic universities. The University of Chicago and Northwestern University dominated every year. Even the 4 major families were at a disadvantage, let alone the other schools. The assessment was conducted twice a year, at the beginning of December and at the beginning of March. Each time, about 100 people participated, but only the top 50 in the theory class would be allowed to continue to the experimental test, which was divided into 7 levels. From top to bottom, they were S, A, B, C, D, and E experiments. Obtaining the C level and above guaranteed their place in the laboratory. It sounded easy, but in fact, most of the people who took part in the test failed the experimental level. Only about half of the 50 people who took the experimental exam could get in.
The proportion is terrifying.
Marvin took a look and couldn't help taking a step back. This kind of place was where great gods went. Michael helped Bessy read the pile of documents and used a red pen to draw important points for her.
Michael, you've never studied what Bessy is studying, right?
Marvin thought for a while and confirmed that he had never studied computer science before. At most, he studied photography and economics at university. Without looking up, Michael faintly said,
Yeah. Then I'm only highlighting the key points for her. I don't need much professional knowledge for that.
Michael slowly turned a page and casually said,
High school knowledge is enough.
Marvin was speechless. He didn't know why he asked. Michael returned to his study after helping Bessy highlight the key experiment content. He pulled out a chair and took out a cigarette from the drawer. The thin smoke wafted up, and he lightly glanced at Patrick through the smoke.
How's the situation?
I haven't found anything useful. Patrick handed the envelope to him and paused.
Why don't we ask Sherry? She has permission at 129.
Everyone thought of 129 if records and investigation were needed.
Wait a little longer.
Michael thought for a while and then snuffed out the cigarette. He opened the window to disperse the smoke. Without saying much, Patrick just took the envelope and went downstairs. He met Marvin, who was moving the flower pot to Bessy's room.
Have you been in contact with Sherry recently?
Patrick asked him. He shook his head.
She hasn't looked for me recently.
He used to be very excited at the mention of Sherry, but this feeling had long disappeared.
She's going to take the intermediate membership examination.
Patrick reminded him again. Slightly surprised, Marvin nodded and muttered expressionlessly,
Oh.
Then he went to the window to pick up his small shovel, which he carefully wiped before putting into his bag. Patrick stared at his back, speechless. Upstairs, Bessy turned on the computer, but Luke's video had yet to pop up. Just then, a video call popped up. It was Jared. Picking up her headset, she put down her book and pen and looked up at him. What's the matter?
Are you going to set the questions for this year's membership assessment?
On the other end, Jared was walking downstairs, his tone absent-minded. Hearing this, Bessy rubbed her temple and said with a headache, "No."
Okay.
Although a little regretful, he wasn't surprised. It was already beyond his expectation that she had set the questions last year.
Oh, there's another matter. You have a new order. Are you taking it?
No. Without even listening to it, Bessy picked up a pen in her right hand and casually wrote on the paper, "I'm hanging up." She directly cut off the connection and opened Luke's video again. Episode 329, A Knot in Jack's Heart. Half a month passed in a flash. Bessy hadn't gone to the nuclear engineering classes or the library in the past 2 weeks. Compared to the library, the laboratory was quieter and more suitable for reading. The laboratory assessments were on the 2nd and 3rd of December. After the second theory test, the results would be obtained in the evening of the 2nd. The top 50 would participate in the experiment test on the 3rd. It was the 1st of December, Friday. Zeke and Tucker finally returned from Hawaii after filming the show. When Tucker called Bessy, she was still doing experiments in the laboratory. "Bessy, I'm back with Uncle Zeke." Tucker had just gotten off the plane. His face was hidden in the hood of his down jacket, and he looked extremely small.
"Let's have dinner together tonight. We've brought you gifts."
Putting the reactor into the container and observing the energy changes, Bessy calmly said, "Okay." After hanging up the phone, she finished the experiment and turned to check the time. At 5 o'clock, she sent a text message to Michael, telling him not to pick her up at 7 p.m. Putting everything into the parcel, she left the building. Zeke's car was parked at the door. Zeke wore a puffy coat and a heavy hat, making him look suffocated and unremarkable. He was very inconspicuous. Bessy got into the back seat. The manager very politely and rigorously greeted her, much less casually than their first meeting. A woman who could make Robert soup pour tea for her. The manager couldn't address her casually. These past few days, he had gotten some ideas about the computer that Tucker played games on that never lagged, but he didn't dare ask Bessy about it, so he turned to look at Zeke. Glancing at him, Zeke slowly took off his shapeless jacket.
"Bessy, where did you buy the computer for Tucker? My manager also wants to play games like that."
While playing a game with her head down, Bessy replied without looking up, "It's out of stock." She had assembled the computer parts herself. There was only one such computer. The manager was stunned. But, thinking about it, she continued, "If you want to play games, there's a good one for 1,000. She slid her fingertips across the game screen and neatly collected an enemy card. Realizing that she was probably talking about the price, the manager quickly transferred the money to Zeke. He didn't have Bessy's number, so he asked Zeke to transfer it on his behalf. However, a computer that cost $1,000. Was it a second-hand computer? He wanted to reject it, but didn't dare to. He was afraid that Zeke would kill him. They went to a restaurant for dinner. In the hotel, James and Jack were already waiting for them. Zeke had already asked for Bessy's opinion regarding Jack. He had invited him only after confirming that she wouldn't be angry with his presence.
"Bessy, Tucker."
James's eyes lit up at the sight of them and stood up. Jack glanced at Tucker first, and his hands hanging at his sides couldn't help shaking. After a long while, he turned to Bessy and greeted her. The Miller family's misfortune was a knot in Jack's heart. Finally seeing a possible future of the Miller family, his attention was focused all on Tucker. Zeke asked how Bessy was doing, then started talking about the show's filming. While they were filming the show, Bessy had either been doing experiments or studying theoretical questions. Michael had helped her organize a lot of information, so she hadn't been free to call Tucker. Tucker had been frantically absorbing knowledge this month and would ask Mr. Bright on Twitter if he didn't understand something. When they talked about the show, the manager also looked up.
"By the way, the first preview of the program is already out. It'll start broadcasting next Saturday."
At the dining table, the manager glanced at Bessy and asked,
"Do you have Twitter? Or if you sign up for an account, I'll have the program group promote you. At that time, you'll surely have at least 1 million fans."
Speaking of the show, he couldn't help but feel excited. He could already imagine the frenzy on the internet when the show was broadcast. Plus, There were the fans who would see that Zeke and Noah were following her. No need. Crossing her legs, she remembered the account at BM that Mary had registered for her and shook her head. I don't want to be involved in the entertainment industry.
Okay then.
The manager glanced at her regretfully. He thought about how popular she would be in the entertainment industry if she wasn't Northwestern University's top scorer. It was almost 8 p.m. when they finished eating. Downstairs, Keith and Ricky couldn't help feeling excited about Tucker's return. They couldn't wait for Tucker and James to return to their old house, so they waited downstairs for them to come out. Jack looked at them, and his lips couldn't help but tremble. He turned to Zeke.
Zeke, Tucker's teachers.
He was talking about Tucker's next teacher. The one who had taught him in Hawaii had already left the day before, after saying that he had nothing else to teach him. Halfway through his sentence, Jack remembered Bessy and James and swallowed back his words. He couldn't reveal this matter yet. If the fourth son was to find out.
Let's take Bessy home first,
said Zeke. Jack, Keith, and the others were anxious to see how talented Tucker was. They had no objection to Zeke's decision and hurriedly urged them to leave. Bessy asked them to park in front of the Highline Apartments. They got out of the car and escorted her to the gate. Putting one hand in her thick windbreaker, she waved to Zeke and Tucker with her other hand. James suddenly thought of something and glanced at her.
Bessy, Tucker will be at home tomorrow. Do you want to come back with Michael for dinner?
Bessy was pulling on her coat's hood. Putting two hands in her pocket, she raised her head with her eyebrows sharp and casually said, "No, I have an exam tomorrow." James wasn't disappointed. He was always surprised that Bessy was willing to talk to him. He just nagged.
You have an exam on Saturday? Isn't it said that going to college is to be free of hardship? You're even busier now.
Standing beside them, Jack heard about Bessy's exam on Saturday and felt puzzled as well. Northwestern University had exams on Saturday? But he didn't think too much about it, and his mind was occupied by Tucker. He urged them to return home and waited for Tucker to go in. The thought of Bessy's exam on Saturday was quickly thrown to the back of his mind. Bessy's exam wasn't as important as Tucker's. Unlike Jack, Zeke was concerned about Bessy. He glanced at James with his beautiful eyes narrowed and coldly asked,
"Who's Michael?"
"Let Bessy bring Michael back for dinner?" His eyes sharpened in displeasure. James subconsciously lowered his voice.
Michael Clark. He's Bessy's friend, a cardiologist. He's very impressive." "A doctor?"
Zeke's voice was faint, and he started thinking about which doctor had the last name Clark in Evanston. He couldn't think of anyone. He nodded. The next time he saw Bessy, he would ask her which hospital Michael belonged to. Bessy walked past the Highline Apartments gate. She walked along the road for a minute before seeing Michael standing under the street lamp. He was wearing a long black woolen coat that was still unable to cover his long legs, and his arms were loosely crossed at his chest. Leaning against the street lamp, his thin and slender figure was extended by the dim light, and his sharp eyebrows were shrouded in a layer of shadow. Seeing her, he straightened his back, put down his hands, and walked forward.
"Are you cold?"
He opened his arms and enveloped her in his coat. "Not really." Bessy turned her face and casually said, "Let's go back. Have you calculated the metrics for the reactor I gave you?" In the past half a month, Michael had practically studied with her. He let go of her and took her hand to pull her towards the apartment.
"I have. It's on your desk."
Bessy was no stranger to experiments, but the reactor had been a bit of a bottleneck situation for her. There were countless experiments, and only after experiencing them personally did she realize why Luke had sent her all of those videos. She understood that even a small mistake could bring irreparable losses. She had to admit it. She had only learned a little bit about this aspect. Theoretical knowledge wasn't difficult for her because her memory was strangely, almost terrifyingly good. But in experiments, theoretical knowledge was just a foundation. She followed Michael back and went to the room to see the reactor he had calculated to compare it to her own. Downstairs, Patrick was amazed.
"Miss Miller is too terrifying."
She was completely different from Michael. Taking a glass of water from the table, Michael glanced at him faintly. Patrick immediately stopped talking about Bessy and opened the briefcase on the table, taking out 2 envelopes.
Michael, I couldn't find it.
Putting his hands on the table, Michael took the envelope, but only casually held it instead of reading it. The next day was Saturday. Bessy got up early. Marvin and the chef knew that she had an exam today. The chef whipped up a scrumptious breakfast, as usual. After Bessy finished eating, Marvin went to talk to the chef in the kitchen. He lowered his voice and blankly looked at the chef.
Miss Miller has to score a perfect 300 today. 100 points isn't a pass.
The chef held the spatula and blankly stared at him. After finishing breakfast at 7:30 a.m., Michael took Bessy to school. A few minutes after they left, Joshua came hoping to visit Bessy. He hadn't expected her to be out again.
Bessy went to meet her classmates again?
Joshua glanced at Marvin, who was busying himself in the room. She had been out meeting with her classmates the last time he came to find her. Looking up, Marvin poured a cup of tea for Joshua and then calmly replied,
Miss Miller went to take her exam.
She has an exam today?
Joshua sat down on the sofa.
What exam?
The butler stood aside and also glanced curiously at Marvin. Marvin glanced at Joshua and respectfully said,
The laboratory assessment.
Joshua lowered his head to drink tea and nodded before suddenly looking up halfway through it.
What did you say?
Accustomed to this, Marvin repeated himself.
The laboratory assessment.
Episode 330, The Laboratory Assessment. Bessy arrived at the Northwestern University laboratory for the assessment. Hundreds of people were standing at the door. Several teachers and professors from various universities were also there. The annual laboratory assessment was a major event in Evanston, so they treated it very seriously.
Are you confident about today's theory test?
Dean Soup stood at the side, looking at Bessy and whispering to her. Bessy put her hands in her pockets. I guess. Her reaction probably meant that she was confident. Passing regular exams wasn't difficult for her, so Dean Soup let her go for the written test first. Standing in place, he looked at Bessy's determined back, then suddenly turned and asked Dr. Weatherby,
Do you think she'll surprise us?
Dr. Weatherby frowned.
Let's see if she's in the top 50 tomorrow morning.
Dean Soup remained silent. The laboratory had 5 floors above ground and 3 floors underground. The whole building was large, and almost all of it was made of glass. The theory test was held in the largest conference room on the first floor. The written test was the first line of defense in the laboratory. If they failed to score within the top 50, they would be directly rejected. Everyone had only one chance, so they were ready to give their all. 100 people were divided into 2 experimentation rooms. There were several monitors and 4 proctors, and the seats were also separated by barriers. Bessy sat down at her seat. The written test papers for the laboratory assessment covered a wide range, not only for a certain subject, but for all aspects of photoelectric and nuclear magnetics. It included a lot of professional SCI problems that were extremely tricky. Northwestern University's midterm exam couldn't compare with this exam's difficulty. The students would fall into that trap if not careful. There were 2 test papers. Flipping through them, Bessy developed a rough gauge of the difficulty. No wonder Northwestern University students said the assessment was perverse. The exam lasted for 150 minutes, 2.5 hours. It seemed like a long time, but in fact, it wasn't enough for a 300-point paper. She picked up her pen and started writing her answers one by one. People who were selected to take this exam from all over the country were top students in their science and technology departments. Almost all of them were seniors who had participated in competitions, whose knowledge in the subject exceeded even their own instructors, and who read books for fun in their spare time. In the beginning, it was easy for many of them to write the answers, but by the time they started the second paper, their speeds began to slow down. Some people spent their time calculating data on scrap paper, while some thought long and hard and were still clueless. Even in such a big space, the 4 proctors all noticed the girl sitting in the last row. She barely raised her head and seldom calculated on the scrap paper. 2 hours later, she put down her pen and flipped through her test papers. A proctor suspected he was seeing things. Pausing, he turned to the person beside him.
"What's she doing?"
The other glanced over and hesitantly said,
"Checking her papers?"
While they were still feeling uncertain, Bessy raised her hand. The proctor thought she had a question and went over to inquire. Having checked her papers and having found no mistakes, Bessy put away her pen and pencil case. Because the exam was still ongoing, she said in a low and concise voice, "I'm handing in my paper." After collecting her things, she glanced at the test proctor, who was standing there without showing any reaction. She paused and slightly pressed her lips, then lowered her voice. "Can't I hand in the paper in advance?"
"Oh, you can."
The teacher reacted and took her paper. Then he looked down at Bessy's name and college. The other proctor also leaned over.
"Name, Bessy Miller from Northwestern University. She's so arrogant."
She dared to submit her paper in advance for this kind of exam? In fact, 2.5 hours wasn't even enough for others to finish the paper. Forget checked it over after finishing it in 2 hours, but she still dared to hand it in advance? After handing the paper, Bessy came out of the exam room and noticed it was only 10 a.m. Instead of returning to the Highline Apartments, she went to the small laboratory in the Comprehension Building to practice her experiments. She used Michael's calculations from last night to experiment with the reactor. Although he wasn't a science and technology major, and he had made many omissions, his different ideas actually provided her with inspiration. She changed her line of thoughts. At 11 a.m., she put the reset reactor in the glass cover. At this time, Kara called. She held the phone to her ear while watching the number on the machine.
"Bessy, did you take the laboratory test today?"
Kara's voice sounded like it was about to explode. Still calmly staring at the reactor, she held the phone away from her ear and waited for Kara to stop roaring before casually saying, "Yeah." The list of assessments was fixed every year, and the Science and Technology Department had announced the list this year. There were only a total of 20 students from the sophomore and junior years. At 10:30 a.m., the seniors who had finished the first part of the exam had started messaging people that they saw Bessy. There were already only a few girls in the department, let alone taking the laboratory assessment. Out of the 100 people, only 4 were girls. Due to her attractive looks, the seniors of Northwestern University's Science and Technology Department recognized Bessy at a glance. After the exam, the news that Bessy had participated in this year's assessment exploded the Science and Technology Department and finally swept the entire Northwestern University forum. A freshman participating in the laboratory assessment in the first semester was an unprecedented event. "There's a rumor in the forum that you took it accidentally. You..." On the other end of the phone, Kara raised her head, not knowing how to describe her feelings. "Are you confident?" she asked. The final reaction in the experiment under the glass cover was complete. Checking the energy data on the machine beside her, Bessy saw that the number was twice as much as the first time. She leaned on the table and chuckled. "Pretty much." At the same time, the results of the first exam were about to be displayed inside the laboratory. They would be posted one by one at around 8 p.m. on the big screen in the middle of the laboratory's first floor. The teachers from Northwestern University and the University of Chicago were all waiting for the written test results. The results were very important to them, and the schools must be notified immediately. Dean Soup and Dr. Weatherby both had chairs beside them, but they weren't in the mood to sit and were just staring at the large screen.
"Dr. Weatherby."
Dean Soup took out a cigarette and just chewed on it. He didn't light it because of the smoking ban.
"Do you think Bessy passed?"
Dr. Weatherby pursed his lips.
"Her theory has always been good. I think she should be able to score somewhere in the 40th to 50th place."
Time had been too tight, and they hadn't prepared well before Bessy took the exam. Dean Soup also felt like she would be stuck at the 40th to 50th place. Those who came in for the exam were all elites from all over the country, who had been trained several years in their junior and senior years. Bessy was a new student who had yet to undergo training. It would be considered a miracle if she passed and was in the 40th to 50th place. At 8 p.m., the big screen marked Laboratory Results flashed. All the waiting teachers in the room immediately stood up and stared at the names on the big screen. On the big screen, the 40th to 50th places appeared. From left to right, there was the student's rank, name, school, and score. The list only showed 10 names. Dr. Weatherby and Dean Soup scanned it several times, but still didn't see Bessy's name. Dr. Weatherby's heart sank.
Maybe she unexpectedly passed the test and placed above the 40th place.
Dean Soup laughed. Dr. Weatherby just silently stared at the screen. 2 minutes later, the screen was refreshed again. This time, it was the 30th to 40th place. When they still didn't see Bessy's name, Dean Soup's smile slowly faded.
Dean Hoffman, your student is going to take first place again.
Next to Dean Soup, a person from the White family looked over at Dean Hoffman, a slightly bald middle-aged man.
4 out of the 30th to 50th places all belonged to your school. Also, Leo White from your school is comparable to Luke. I heard that he was accepted as an apprentice by the teacher of his academy in his freshman year. The first place should belong to your school if everything goes right.
The University of Chicago had won first place in the laboratory assessment for a long time, but in March this past year, Luke had unexpectedly taken the place. The University of Chicago had been very angry. In December, they had especially found Leo, a junior who had long been accepted as an apprentice by the Institute's doctors. He didn't need to take the exam, but he had been brought out this time to save the school's face. The bald, middle-aged man modestly smiled. He turned to Dean Soup and said,
Dean Soup, I heard that your new queen student also participated in the assessment this year. She took part in the assessment earlier than Luke. It seems like there'll be another miracle this year, huh? I have yet to see her name in the last 20 places, so your queen must have entered the top 30 places.
Rumors that Bessy's name had been entered by mistake had long spread inside the laboratory. The University of Chicago had some people in charge of the laboratory. Could Dean Hoffman also know this? He had also estimated her results. Bessy hadn't participated in the training, so he estimated that she would place in the 40th place at most. But after the scores were refreshed twice, her name still hadn't appeared. So he was sure that Bessy had failed to place within the top 50. He was stating the obvious and mocking Dean Soup. The two universities had harbored deep grudges toward one another.